Hello everyone, welcome to SJ's classes. In this video lesson, I will be discussing the 20th century literary critic S Eliot. In the first part of this video lesson, I will discuss his biography. In the second part, we will analyze him as a literary critic, and the last part, we will look at some of his important contributions to English literary criticism. If you haven't yet subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do subscribe. And also, if you haven't yet watched my video lessons on classical criticism, medieval and Renaissance criticism, neoclassical criticism, as well as romantic and Victorian criticism, please do watch it. It's there in my YouTube channel. So let us begin with a short introduction to the biography of S Eliot. Thomas Stearns Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri on September 26, 1888 and died in London on January 4, 1965. It was in London that Eliot came under the influence of his contemporary Ezra Pound, who recognized his poetic genius at once and assisted in the publication of his work in a number of magazines. His first book of poems, Prufrock and Other Observations, was published in 1917 and immediately established him as a leading poet of the avant-garde. With the publication of The Wasteland in 1922, now considered by many to be the single most influential poetic work of the 20th century, Eliot's reputation began to grow to nearly mythic proportions. By 1930, and for the next 30 years, he was the most dominant figure in poetry and literary criticism in the English-speaking world. His major later poetry collections include Ash Wednesday, that came out in 1930, 4 quartets. His books of literary and social criticism include The Sacred Wood, that came out in 1920, The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, 1933, After Strange Gods, that came out in 1934, and Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, that came out in 1940. Eliot was also an important playwright whose verse dramas include Murder in the Cathedral, The Family Reunion, and The Cocktail Party. Now let us look at S Eliot as a literary critic. A complete change came about imaginative literature and criticism between the years 1910 and 1939. One of the reasons was the profound contributions made by S Eliot. He was a man of strong convictions, and perhaps that is why, through his preface for Lancelot and Truce that came out in 1928, he openly described him as a classicist in literature, a royalist in politics, and an Anglo-Catholic in religion. Eliot was a highly religious person. His strong dogmatic belief in the idea of the original sin is seen in works like After Strange Gods. For him, his faith in religion, belief in politics, and concept of literature form one unified whole. Eliot gave the title The Sacred Wood to his first book of criticism. He borrowed it from James G. Fraser's The Golden Bough, in which a ritual is described where the priest occupies a sacred wood, driving away any contender to the priesthood. Eliot implied that, as critic or poet, he was entering this sacred wood, challenging any contender for the position. Eliot's critical career falls into 3 stages. The first one between 1919 and 1928, with interest in 16th and 17th century dramatists and poets. Some of the important works of this period are Sacred Wood, Essays on Poetry and Criticism, Homage to John Dryden, 3 essays, and for Lancelot and Truce, Essays on Style and Order. The second one is between 1929 and 1939, and during this period he published some of his social and religious criticism. And some of the important works are Dante, Thoughts After Lambeth, the use of poetry and the use of criticism after Strange Goats, and also Elizabethan essays that came out in 1934. The third and the final stage is the post-war period, which shows a return to the earlier interest, though not in the form of the first phase. His works in this period include Notes Towards Definition of Culture and To Criticize the Critic. And these works show the shift of his focus from purely literary to aspects related to culture and civilization. It is also during this time that he became the editor of the quarterly Criterion. Now let us look at some of his important works in detail. In 1919, he wrote a very important essay titled Tradition and the Individual Talent. It appeared in 2 installments in the journal The Egoist. This piece of literary criticism is considered as the unofficial manifesto of T.S. Eliot's criticism. In it, he described tradition as something which adheres to the historical sense. This is one of the important terms that he has introduced. Now let us look at this term. Let us try to understand it. To Eliot, historical sense meant a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. How does past writers, how does past literature contribute to the working out of your present work of art? This historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his thoughts, but with the feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer, must have a profound presence in the work. And that is what specifically T.S. Eliot calls as historical sense, the presence of the past in his work. Eliot states that it is the historical sense that makes a writer traditional. He is of the opinion that this sense defies chronology and conceives the past as timeless and existing here and now. For Eliot, the individual poet does not matter, as no poet can be understood in his own terms. The most valuable parts of a work are those in which the dead poets and his ancestors assert their immortality vigorously. He uses the term the mind of the Europe to refer to this organic tradition or the awareness of the dead writers. Let us come to his one of the other important works of T.S. Eliot. One of the other important contributions that T.S. Eliot has made towards literary criticism is his theory of impersonality in poetry. As a man of strong convictions, he believed that the poet must subordinate himself to tradition, as it is more important than the poet and his personality. Now this is popularly known as the theory of impersonality, or the impersonality theory of poetry. The progress of an artist, as far as Eliot is considered, happens when he continuously sacrifices his personality. Poetry for Eliot is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality, and that is why he dismisses Wordsworth's theory of emotions recollected in tranquility. Eliot raises the argument that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from it. Now, so as to understand his concept of depersonalization, Eliot gives us the example of a chemical reaction. When a piece of platinum is introduced into a gas chamber containing sulfur and carbon dioxide, the two combines to form sulfurous acid. But in the process, the platinum itself remains unchanged. The mind of the poet is this platinum. It actually is a catalyst, and the mind of the poet must act like a catalyst. The emotions and feelings are sulfur and carbon dioxide. The artist's mind keeps forming compounds, but he remains separate in the entire process of creation. So that is all regarding his impersonality theory. Now let us look at some of his other notable contributions. Yet another concept that one comes across while reading T.S. Eliot is dissociation of sensibility. In his famous essay, The Metaphysical Poets, published in 1921, He asserts that in the 17th century, a dissociation of sensibility set in from which we have never recovered. The result was a decline in poetic quality. In the Jacobean dramatist and the metaphysical poets, there is a direct sensuous apprehension of thought or a recreation of thought into feeling. So there was this amalgamation, this blending of thought and feeling as far as Jacobean and metaphysical poets and writers were concerned. But in the later poets, thought and feeling got dissociated. And it dissociated more and more. This is what he terms as dissociation of sensibility, the splitting of thought from feeling. The metaphysical poets possess the power to amalgamate disparate experiences, and a loss of this power results in the separation of thought and feeling. Eliot calls this separation as the dissociation of sensibility. Eliot's introduction of the concept of objective correlative is also something to be commended. It appears in his essay Hamlet and His Problems, which appeared in the collection The Sacred Wood. He describes objective correlative as the only way of expressing emotion in the form of art. It is a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion. According to Eliot, the poet cannot transmit his emotions directly to the reader, and therefore it requires a medium. This medium may be a situation, a set of objects, or a chain of ideas. What the poet has to convey gets objectified through this medium, and hence interaction between the poet and the reader takes place. It is for the lack of this that he called Shakespeare's Hamlet as an artistic failure. So these are some of his important contributions towards English literary criticism. I gave you a brief introduction to his biography. I discussed some of his popular essays and also pointed out some of the important terms and thoughts that he has shared to the realm of English literary criticism. Thank you so much for watching this video lesson. In the next video lesson, I will discuss I.A. Richards, yet another important 20th century literary critic. Thank you.